Dividing positive and negative numbers. Just like the other operations, division has rules as well. The first thing you need to know when it comes to dividing positive and negative numbers is the multiplicative inverse. Although this is a multiplication property, it's super helpful when we're dividing. A multiplicative inverse is just the inverse of a number. So if you're looking for the multiplicative inverse of 8, it would be 1 over 8. That's because 8 is actually 8 over 1, so you just flip it. If you're looking for the multiplicative inverse of 1/2, you flip it, and the multiplicative inverse is 2 over 1. If you're looking for the inverse of -3, it would be -1/3. Our rule says that the product of a non-zero number and its multiplicative inverse is 1. Let's test this by multiplying all of our numbers with their multiplicative inverses here in these examples. So our first one was 8 and 1/8. So if we do 8 multiplied by 1 over 8, remember when you're multiplying fractions, you turn them all into fractions. So if you just have an integer like 8, you put it over 1, and you multiply across. So you do numerator times numerator, which is 8 in the numerator, over denominator times denominator, which is 1 times 8, which is 8. 8 over 8 is equal to 1, so that's true. Let's try again for 1/2 and for 1/2 and 2 over 1. 1/2 multiplied by its multiplicative inverse, which is 2 over 1, is equal to, again, multiply across the top first, 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 1 is 2, which is equal to 1. And our last example is this one here. -3 multiplied by -1/3. Remember, 3 becomes -3 over 1 equals -3 times -1 is just 3. Remember, a negative multiplied by a negative gives you a positive over 1 times 3, which is 3, which equals 1. Our next rule is the division rule, and you can think of that as more of a strategy. To divide one number by another, multiply the first number by the multiplicative inverse of the second number. Let's try an example that we know. Let's try this on 8 divided by 2. So many of you will know just from previous experience that 8 divided by 2 will give you 4. But let's test out our method. So we have 8, and then it tells us that multiply the first number, which is our 8, by the multiplicative inverse of the second number. So we're going to multiply that by the multiplicative inverse of 2, which is 1/2, and see if we get the same thing. So remember, 8 can become 8 over 1. Multiply across the numerators. 8 times 1 is 8. 1 times 2 is 2, which gives you 8/2, which is equal to 4. So now we know that this works. In this example, it might not seem necessary to do this second step here when you could have done it this way in the first place, but as the problems get more difficult, you'll see that it's a very useful strategy. Now pause the video to practice on your own. When you're finished, start the video again and check your answers as I go through them. For our first two examples, we're told to find the multiplicative inverse. So remember, the multiplicative inverse is just what you would get if you turned the number into a fraction and flipped it. So if we make -27 into -27 over 1, then our multiplicative inverse is -1 over 27. It doesn't matter whether you put your negative in the numerator or the denominator. A negative in either place will mean the same thing. However, if you have a negative in both, that's incorrect. You can only have one negative for a fraction in order for it to be negative. Our next example is to find the multiplicative inverse of 3/8. To flip that, you just get 8/3. Now the problems get more exciting. In the second part, we're instructed to find the quotient. The quotient is just the answer of a division problem, so it means you're dividing. So if you remember in our previous slide, we were told that you use the multiplicative inverse of your second number. So you take the first number, which is -5/8, and now instead of dividing, we multiply by the multiplicative inverse, which is 10 over 3. Now you multiply across. Make sure that you remember your signs here. So we have a negative multiplied by a positive number. So that's going to give you a negative overall. 5 times 10 is equal to 50. And 8 times 3 is equal to 24. Now you can simplify. 50 divided by 2 will give you 25, and you can also divide 24 by 2, which will give you 12. And that's your simplified answer. For our last example on this page, we have negative 64 divided by negative 4. So both of these are negative numbers, so we know our final answer will be positive. So we have negative 64, we'll put that over 1 to make our fraction multiplication easier, multiplied by negative 4, and the multiplicative inverse of negative 4 is negative 1 over 4. So we know our answer will be positive, and we do 64 multiplied by 1, which is 64, 1 times 4, which is 4, and 64 divided by 4 is 16. And that's your final answer. For the last part of this video, I want to talk about a way to remember the division rule, and that way is called keep, change, flip. Let's try this using the example 4 divided by 2/3. Whenever you're dividing fractions, you can do keep, change, flip. So we're going to keep the first number, change the sign, and flip the fraction into its multiplicative inverse. So keeping the first one, we have 4. Change, we're going to change this to a multiplication sign, and you're going to flip your fraction. So 3 halves. So again, we can make this 4 over 1. Multiply across, 4 times 3 is 12. 12, and then 1 times 2 is 2. 12 divided by 2 gives you 6. This is the same thing as multiplying by the multiplicative inverse. So we multiply, so we change that sign, and then we take the multiplicative inverse of 2/3 and multiply by 3 halves. And that's our flip. Let's try one more example just to make sure we've got it. 5/8 divided by 1/5. Go ahead and pause the video and try using keep, change, flip to solve that yourself. Alright, now let's check your answer. 5/8. So we're keeping the first fraction, changing the sign to multiplication, and flipping the second fraction into its multiplicative inverse. So keep, change, flip. Now we do 5 times 5, which is 25, divided by 8 times 1, which is 8. And unless it tells you otherwise, it's always okay to leave your answer as a simplified improper fraction.